Mic check 1 2. What it do? It's your boy T Word, the People's Champ. Thanks for tapping in. This is the Mic Check podcast. Today we're talking about ridiculous fantasy fights that just might happen. It is 2023, the year if anything can happen. So we're gonna talk about it today. But before we get into the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We appreciate that feedback. All right, so want to jump on here today and talk to you guys about some fantasy fights that have been floating around the internet ever since Terrence Crawford made what looked to be easy work of Errol Spence. Regardless of what he says, he made that fight look very comfortable for him. So now people are looking for greater challenges for the two-time undisputed champion, including Jermell Charlo, Canelo Alvarez, Gervonta Tank Davis, etc. Even Jaron Boots Ennis is in the mix. Now, of all those fights, Jermell Charlo's a reasonable assumption for Crawford. Jaron Boots Ennis is a reasonable assumption for Crawford because they are in or around his weight class very closely, within 7 pounds. So those aren't really fantasy fights to me, outside of the fact that I don't think he has a desire to fight Boots. So without the right amount of money, it's not going to happen. But when you start to put in people like Canelo Alvarez at 160 pounds, Gervonta Tank Davis down at 147, after the fact that Terrence Crawford has expressed that he wasn't exactly that comfortable making 147 to face Errol Spence either. So staying down at 147 to bring up Tank, who's probably been at his best at 135, that just makes it real fantasy to me. I think it's a ridiculous fantasy fight. So I'm going to check that off, as I extremely doubt that this would happen. Even though the money's there, Terrence Crawford won't get the credit he deserves for beating Gervonta Davis because of the fact that Tank has never fought above 140, and even then, he was around 138 pounds. And his opponent was a 140-pound regular champion who was put under a rehydration clause, so he wasn't even filled out to his maximum ring walk weight. So when you think about that, he's never actually fought at 140, to be honest. So I don't think 147 is in the future for Tank, unless it's a closeout fight where he and Terrence Crawford decide that they're going to retire after making a boatload of money. And you would get it to sell because you could hype it up as two knockout artists stepping in the ring. But again, ridiculous fantasy fight, check. Now, let's talk about Terrence Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez. This one also falls under, I would say, ridiculous fantasy fight to some degree, but to a lesser degree than, say, a Gervonta Davis fight. Now, the money associated with fighting Canelo Alvarez is going to dwarf any money he'd make fighting Tank Davis, because, as many believe, Canelo is still the face of boxing. So let's say Canelo was to fight Jermell Charlo in September, and then he's already scheduled to fight Terrence Crawford in February of 2024. So within 5 months, he's going to probably weigh in under 168 to face Charlo, and then he'd be able to get down to 160 on the dot to face Terrence Crawford. That's the only likely scenario I could see. And that would also fall in line with the PBC agreements that have been made. Now, there's been word that leaked out of Canelo's camp from Eddie Reynoso that they want to fight against Jermell Charlo and then follow that right up with Jermall Charlo. But if an opportunity to fight a two-time undisputed champion from the marketing and money standpoint, you kind of go that route. You know what I mean? So while I think that it's a little bit of a ridiculous fantasy fight to some degree, I think it's very plausible because the money would be there from the Canelo side and make it very enticing for Terrence Crawford to go up to 160 pounds. Now, if you watched any recent interviews since he beat Errol Spence Jr., he did state that he had no desire to go higher than maybe 154. But then when he was on the Breakfast Club and talked about Canelo Alvarez with Charlamagne the God, he did say, well, I'll meet him at 158. But he first said 160, then 158. So if you just listen to, read between the lines, he'd entertain 160 if he needed to. It is a 13-pound jump for him, but in reality, he's probably about to be at 54 anyway. So really, it's about a 6-pound jump from where he's probably most comfortable. So I'm not going to mark this as a full ridiculous fantasy fight, but it's very close. Next up, Inoue moving up to 130 pounds and Gervonta Davis melting down to 130 pounds for a mega fight between the Japanese superstar and the next face of boxing. So the crazy thing about this is the first time I heard it, I was like, man, don't bring Inoue up there because he's just going to get hurt. Tank been at 135 too long. But then Floyd Mayweather comes out and says, well, hey, do it at a catch weight, like 130, and do it in America, do the VADA testing, etc. I agree with all those terms. I think that I've seen Tank shrink down, and he's weighed in at like 133. So that means he could get down to 130 just to scale one time, especially if they do like an early Friday weigh-in like they've been doing. So I don't think that it's ridiculous to believe that this fight will happen. But again, when I first heard it, it was completely far-fetched. But when you start talking 130, you talk about doing it in the States, it's going to make the money. Knockout artist versus knockout artist. And Inoue is known to be somebody who likes to accept challenges. Tank apparently likes either blown up or drained down opponents, as that's the rub on him, they say. I don't subscribe to that opinion. But if you put those two factors together, this fight could happen, and it could happen within the next year. It's reasonable to believe that Inoue is going to be undisputed at 122 by the end of this year. So he'll have a little time on his hands before he maybe wants to go up to 126. Why not take an opportunity to make some big American money, some big global money, and not just big Japanese money, and actually get in there and fight Tank? And the good news for him is win, lose, or draw, he wins. He's going to get worldwide notoriety beyond what he already has. And then if he loses, nobody's going to blame him because he dared to be great, as they like to say when fighters move up in weight. So while I thought it was ridiculous at first, I do believe that this is a fight that could happen. I would probably favor Tank in that, even though he's coming down to 135. But at the end of the day, coming down from 135. But at the end of the day, I think it would be cool to see and, see whose power holds up at that catch weight, and may the best man win. But again, I still favor Tank in that one. But guys, would love to get your thoughts on that. What do you think about these ridiculous or semi-ridiculous or just plain old fantasy fights? Crawford versus Canelo, Crawford versus Tank, and Tank versus Inoue. What do you think about these fights? Are they ridiculous, regular, or are these fights that could actually happen? So this has been T for the Mic Check Podcast. Until the next time, I'm out. Peace.